On November 13, 1985, a volcanic eruption in Colombia triggered one of the deadliest natural disasters of the 20th century. The Nevado del Ruiz eruption didn't produce massive lava flows or towering ash columns that dominated the sky for days. Instead, this relatively small eruption melted a glacier, and in doing so, erased an entire town from existence in under 2 hours. Over 23,000 people lost their lives that night, with some estimates reaching as high as 25,000. The town of Armero, home to nearly 29,000 residents, was buried under rivers of mud and debris that moved faster than most people could run. But how exactly did a volcano that barely ranked as a moderate eruption on the Volcanic Explosivity Index cause such catastrophic loss of life? And why, despite multiple warnings in the hours and even weeks leading up to the disaster, were the people of Armero never evacuated? Watch closely, because the story of Nevado del Ruiz isn't just about a volcano. It's about the deadly consequences of ignoring science, bureaucratic failures, and a series of decisions that turned a survivable event into a preventable massacre. Nevado del Ruiz towers 17,717 feet above sea level in the Andes Mountains of central Colombia, roughly 80 miles west of Bogotá. The stratovolcano sits within the Los Nevados National Natural Park and is part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, a region infamous for its intense seismic and volcanic activity. The name Nevado translates to snow-covered, and for good reason. Despite being located near the equator, Ruiz's summit is perpetually capped with thick glaciers and ice fields, some measuring over 80 feet deep. This ice cap, while beautiful, would become the catalyst for unimaginable destruction. The volcano had been relatively quiet for over 140 years. Its last major eruption occurred in 1845, killing roughly 1,000 people through similar lahar events. But by 1985, that disaster had long faded from collective memory. Most residents of the surrounding valleys had no personal or familial connection to the mountain's violent past. To them, Nevado del Ruiz was simply part of the landscape, a scenic backdrop to daily life. That complacency would prove fatal. Throughout 1984 and into early 1985, Nevado del Ruiz began showing unmistakable signs of reawakening. Seismic activity beneath the mountain increased steadily. Small earthquakes rattled the region with growing frequency. Fumaroles, vents that release volcanic gases, began appearing near the summit, releasing sulfurous plumes into the air. Steam emissions intensified, and locals reported the smell of rotten eggs, a telltale sign of hydrogen sulfide gas escaping from deep within the earth. By March 1985, geologists and volcanologists were deeply concerned. Scientists from the Colombian Institute of Geological and Mining Research, known as INGEOMINAS, conducted field surveys and monitoring operations. They documented increased thermal activity, changes in gas composition, and persistent seismic tremors. International experts were consulted. The United Nations Disaster Relief Organization sent advisors. The message was clear. Nevado del Ruiz was waking up, and the communities below were at serious risk. In July 1985, a hazard map was created. This map identified the most vulnerable areas in the event of an eruption, and it painted a chilling picture. The town of Armero sat directly in the path of potential lahars flowing down the Lagunilla River Valley. If the ice cap melted, Armero would be hit first and hit hardest. The map was distributed to local and national authorities, but it was never effectively communicated to the public. In fact, many residents of Armero never saw the map at all. Those who did hear vague warnings were told not to panic, that scientists were still studying the situation. There was no evacuation plan, no drills, no clear chain of command for issuing emergency orders. Then on September 11, 1985, a smaller eruption occurred. Ash fell across nearby towns. Lahars formed and traveled several miles down river valleys, but they were relatively small and caused no deaths. For many officials, this became a reason to downplay future risks. They reasoned that if this was the worst Ruiz could do, then the danger had been overstated. This false sense of security would cost thousands of lives just 2 months later. November 13, 1985 began as an ordinary day in Armero. Children went to school, Adults headed to work in the cotton fields, rice paddies, and local markets. The town, located in the department of Tolima, was a vibrant agricultural hub known for its warm climate and fertile soil. At 17,717 feet above sea level, Nevado del Ruiz seemed distant, almost irrelevant to daily life in the valley below. But beneath the surface, the volcano was reaching a critical threshold. Throughout the morning and early afternoon, seismic instruments detected a sharp increase in volcanic tremors. By 3 p.m., the activity had intensified to the point that scientists at the Manizales Volcanic Observatory raised concerns. However, communication infrastructure in the region was limited. Phone lines were unreliable, radio broadcasts were sporadic, and even when warnings were issued, they were vague and contradictory. At around 3:06 p.m., a significant explosion occurred within the volcano's crater. Ash and steam vented into the atmosphere, visible from miles away. Residents in nearby towns noticed the plume but were unsure what it meant. Some officials reassured the public that this was normal volcanic activity and not a cause for alarm. Others recommended staying indoors and monitoring local radio stations. No evacuation orders were given. By 9 p.m., the eruption had intensified. A Plinian eruption column, a dense and powerful upward blast of gas and volcanic material, punched through the ice cap and reached heights of nearly 5 miles into the sky. The heat from the eruption, though not exceptionally high compared to other major eruptions, was enough to begin rapidly melting the glaciers covering Ruiz's summit. Within minutes, millions of gallons of water were released. This water mixed with volcanic ash, rock fragments, and loose debris on the mountain slopes. The result was the formation of lahars, fast-moving mudflows with the consistency of wet concrete. These lahars began racing down the mountain at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour, following the natural channels carved by rivers and valleys. The lahars generated by Nevado del Ruiz on the night of November 13th were not uniform. Multiple flows formed simultaneously, each following different drainage paths down the mountain. The most catastrophic of these flows descended along the Azufrado, Lagunilla, and Guali River valleys. The Lagunilla River, which flowed directly toward Armero, carried the deadliest lahar of all. As the mudflows descended, they picked up everything in their path. Boulders weighing several tons were swept along like pebbles. Trees were uprooted and shredded into splinters. Soil, vegetation, and volcanic debris combined into a viscous slurry that gained mass and momentum with every mile. By the time the lahars reached the lower slopes, some flows were over 150 feet wide and nearly 50 feet deep. They moved with terrifying speed, carving through river valleys and obliterating anything that stood in their way. At approximately 11 p.m., witnesses in the highlands reported hearing a sound like continuous thunder or the roar of a freight train. The ground trembled. Animals fled in panic. Those who ventured outside described seeing a dark, churning wall advancing through the darkness, illuminated only by occasional flashes of lightning from the ash cloud above. In Armero, most residents were indoors. Some were listening to the radio for updates. Others had gone to bed, exhausted from the day's work. A few had heard rumors of potential danger but had no idea that within minutes their town would cease to exist. At 11:25 p.m., the first lahar struck Armero. There was no time to react. The mudflow surged into the northern edge of town, demolishing homes and sweeping people into the current. Within seconds, entire blocks were submerged. The lahar's force was so immense that concrete buildings crumbled like cardboard, cars were tossed like toys, power lines snapped, plunging the town into total darkness. Survivors later described the sound as deafening, a roar so loud it drowned out screams. The air filled with the smell of sulfur and wet earth. People scrambled onto rooftops, clinging to anything they could find. But the rooftops themselves were torn away, and those who had sought refuge there were pulled into the torrent. The lahar continued to surge through Armero for nearly 2 hours, layer after layer of mud burying the town under as much as 16 feet of debris in some areas. When the sun rose on November 14, 1985, the scale of the disaster became horrifyingly clear. Armero, a town that had been home to nearly 29,000 people just hours before, was gone. In its place lay a vast, gray wasteland of hardened mud, shattered wood, and twisted metal. The landscape had been completely transformed. Streets, buildings, parks, and plazas had vanished beneath a blanket of volcanic sediment. Only a few scattered structures remained standing, their walls partially collapsed and caked in dried mud. The town's church, once a central landmark, was reduced to rubble. The hospital where many had sought shelter was obliterated. Schools, homes, and businesses all erased. Rescue teams arrived by helicopter and on foot. But the scene they encountered was beyond comprehension. Bodies were buried under meters of solidified mud. Some victims were found entombed in the debris, frozen in their final moments. Others were never recovered at all. The official death toll was eventually set at approximately 23,000, though some estimates suggest the true number may have been closer to 25,000. In addition to Armero, the nearby town of Chinchina was also struck by lahars, resulting in the deaths of roughly 1,800 people. Dozens of smaller villages and rural communities were damaged or destroyed. In total, Nevado del Ruiz's eruption claimed over 25,000 lives, making it the second deadliest volcanic disaster of the 20th century, surpassed only by the 1902 eruption of Mount Pelée in Martinique. Rescue operations were chaotic and hampered by poor infrastructure. Roads leading to Armero were blocked by debris. Bridges had been swept away. Communication networks were down. International aid began arriving within days, but for most victims it was already too late. Survivors who had managed to escape the initial lahar faced new dangers. Injuries, dehydration, and exposure claimed additional lives in the days following the disaster. Makeshift refugee camps were established in nearby towns, but resources were scarce. The psychological trauma was immense. Entire families had been wiped out. Children were found wandering alone, covered in mud, searching for parents who would never be found. The Nevado del Ruiz disaster is often cited as a textbook example of how a natural hazard became a human catastrophe due to failures in communication, coordination, and decision-making. The science was sound. Volcanologists had correctly identified the risk. Hazard maps had been created. Warnings had been issued. So why were the people of Armero never evacuated? The answer lies in a tangled web of bureaucratic inertia, political pressure, and a fundamental disconnect between scientists and local authorities. In the weeks leading up to the eruption, scientists repeatedly urged government officials to take action. They presented data showing increased seismic activity, gas emissions, and thermal anomalies. They warned that a major eruption could trigger catastrophic lahars. But their warnings were met with skepticism and resistance. Local politicians worried that evacuation orders would cause panic and economic disruption. Tourism and agriculture were vital to the region's economy, and officials feared that even a false alarm could damage the area's reputation. There was also a lack of trust in scientific predictions. The September eruption had been relatively minor, and many officials believed that scientists were exaggerating the danger. On the day of the eruption, communication failures compounded the problem. When the eruption intensified in the evening, scientists attempted to alert authorities in Armero, but phone lines were down, radio broadcasts were delayed or contradictory. Some messages advised residents to stay calm and remain indoors. Others suggested that people should evacuate to higher ground, but provided no specific instructions on where to go or how to get there. In some cases, local officials actively discouraged evacuation, fearing that it would cause more harm than good. The mayor of Armero was reportedly advised that the danger had passed just hours before the lahars struck. By the time the severity of the situation became clear, it was too late. The lahars were already descending the mountain, and there was no way to warn the people of Armero in time. In the aftermath, multiple investigations were launched to determine what went wrong. Reports highlighted systemic failures at every level of government. There was no unified emergency response plan, no clear chain of command, no established protocols for issuing evacuation orders. The disaster exposed deep flaws in Colombia's disaster preparedness infrastructure and sparked widespread calls for reform. The 1985 eruption of Nevado del Ruiz fundamentally changed how the world approaches volcanic hazard management. In the years following the disaster, governments, scientific organizations, and international agencies recognized that even small eruptions could have catastrophic consequences if proper precautions were not taken. The tragedy became a case study in disaster risk reduction, taught in universities and referenced in policy discussions around the globe. It forced the global community to confront an uncomfortable truth: that scientific knowledge alone is meaningless without effective communication, political will, and public trust. One of the most significant outcomes was the establishment of improved early warning systems. Colombia invested heavily in upgrading its volcanic monitoring networks. Seismometers, gas sensors, and thermal cameras were installed on Nevado del Ruiz and other active volcanoes throughout the country. Real-time data transmission systems were developed to ensure that scientists could quickly communicate findings to emergency management officials. By the early 1990s, Colombia had established one of the most sophisticated volcanic monitoring programs in Latin America, with continuous surveillance of its most dangerous peaks. International cooperation also expanded dramatically. The Volcanic Disaster Assistance Program, a collaboration between the United States Geological Survey and the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, was created in direct response to the Nevado del Ruiz disaster. Launched in 1986, this program deploys rapid response teams to volcanic crises worldwide, providing expertise, equipment, and training to help communities prepare for and respond to eruptions. Since its inception, the program has responded to dozens of volcanic emergencies across the globe, from the Philippines to Ecuador, helping to save countless lives. The program's success at Mount Pinatubo in 1991, where timely evacuations saved an estimated 5,000 to 20,000 lives, validated the approach pioneered in response to Nevado del Ruiz. The disaster also highlighted the critical importance of public education and community preparedness. In the years since 1985, communities living near active volcanoes have been trained to recognize warning signs, understand evacuation routes, and respond quickly to official alerts. Educational campaigns in schools teach children about volcanic hazards, ensuring that future generations grow up with an awareness of the risks. Disaster drills are now conducted regularly in high-risk areas, simulating evacuation scenarios and testing communication systems. Local governments have established clear chains of command, designated emergency shelters, and created detailed evacuation maps that are widely distributed and regularly updated. Perhaps most importantly, the Nevado del Ruiz disaster demonstrated the deadly consequences of ignoring or downplaying scientific warnings for political or economic reasons. In the decades since, this lesson has been reinforced repeatedly. The successful evacuations before the 1991 Mount Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines, the 2010 Eyjafjallajökull eruption in Iceland, and the ongoing management of Mount Vesuvius in Italy all reflect a growing recognition that short-term economic concerns must never override the imperative to protect human life. Governments have learned, sometimes through bitter experience, that the cost of evacuation pales in comparison to the cost of mass casualties. Nevado del Ruiz itself remains active and continues to pose a significant threat to surrounding communities. The volcano experiences periodic unrest, with seismic swarms, gas emissions, and minor eruptions occurring regularly over the decades. In 1989, just 4 years after the catastrophic eruption, another event triggered lahars that descended the mountain. However, thanks to improved monitoring and coordinated response efforts, authorities issued timely evacuation orders. Thousands of residents were moved to safety, and not a single life was lost. This success story, born from the ashes of tragedy, demonstrated that the lessons of 1985 had been learned and applied effectively. In 2012 and again in 2015, Nevado del Ruiz experienced elevated activity that prompted evacuations and emergency alerts. Each time, the response was swift and coordinated. Scientists provided clear, actionable information. Authorities issued evacuation orders without hesitation. Communities responded calmly and efficiently. These successful responses stand in stark contrast to the chaos and confusion of November 13, 1985, and serve as a testament to how far disaster preparedness has come. Today, the site of Armero stands as a haunting memorial to those who perished. The town was never rebuilt. Instead, the area has been preserved as a sacred space, a monument to the victims, and a reminder of the consequences of unheeded warnings. Twisted metal beams protrude from the hardened,